Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your pal Alkadron coming at you with another Pauper EDH deck tech for your viewing enjoyment. Guys, I'm really excited to talk about this commander. This is, on paper, one of my favorite decks. This guy right here is a Marsh Crocodile. He's a 4-mana 4/4 in black and blue with 2 enter the battlefield abilities that are both phenomenal. The first thing he does when he enters the battlefield is he returns a black or blue creature you control to its owner's hand. So when he comes in, he bounces another one of your creatures to hand, which is great. We can use that with a bunch of cheap black-blue enters the battlefield effects to get a lot of value out of that. The second thing he does when he comes into play is he makes everyone discard a card, which is fantastic. This is a hand destruction champion. So, one of the reasons this is one of my favorite decks on paper is that this deck has so much going on. There's about 100 different things happening in this deck, and they're all interrelated and intertwined, and they all connect in really cool, interesting ways that synergize with each other. And the theory crafting here and the deck crafting is really fascinating. And I love to think about it and talk about it. I keep on saying the words on paper because actually playing this deck is a miserable grind. He is a long game control engine with his bouncing things for incremental value. He's dedicating you to playing the long game against players who don't have hands. This is one of the grindiest decks I have, and playing against it is just a miserable slog. And that kind of makes playing with it into a miserable slog. It's not super fun to play, but it is really fun to think about and talk about. So I want to talk to you about it today. I have this stack of cards here. I've tried my best to categorize these cards from the deck into themes that the deck is about, and it's a huge challenge because of, like I said, this deck has so much going on and it's all so interconnected and intertwined. It's very hard to create like clear delineations between groups of cards in here, but I did my best. There's going to be a lot of me going back and forth between these piles and talking about what we do and how they're all connected and how they relate to the other groups. So bear with me through that. Before we get started on those individual cards, I do want to mention that there's a couple major overarching themes running through this deck. We already talked about the first one, being able to play cheap value, enter the battlefield creatures, get some value out of those guys, and then bounce them to your hand so you can get that value again. So self-bounce and flicker with some cheap ETBs, that's going to be a big theme that we're going to work with. The other really big theme we're going to work with is discard. The commander is going to force a lot of discard from people's hands, including your own. You don't get to dodge that. It's not only opponents, it's each player. So he makes you discard your own stuff as well. But he makes everyone else discard as well, and he's reusable in that effect. So you can, with the amount of self-bounce and the amount of flicker we have, we should be triggering his own enter the battlefield effects really often. We should be destroying hands very efficiently in this deck. The last sub-theme I want to talk about related to this discard effect is stuff like Madness and Flashback. So we're going to see when your commander's making you discard cards from your own hand, Madness is just a gift. It's free real estate. It lets you completely dodge the drawback and turn it into an advantage. It's crazy powerful. And there's some flashback effects in here as well. We can pitch those into the graveyard to his discard effect and then still get use out of them later. So just tons of value for days. Let's get right into it. The first category I have here, this is the discard suite. You'll notice it's all black. We're going to go through them one piece at a time. Burglar Rats, Liliana Spectre, Cackling Fiend. All of these cards have the exact same effect. When they enter the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. Cackling Fiend is very obviously the worst of these at 4 mana. This effect kind of isn't really worth 4 mana, but I keep him in here anyway. We're 100 card singleton, commons only. We kind of need all the redundancy we can get with these global discard effects. There are cheaper things that make a target opponent discard, like Ravenous Rats maybe, but I want the entire board to share in my misery, so Cackling Fiend gets the seat. Burglar Rats is the balanced version of Cackling Fiend for 2 mana. This is what Cackling Fiend should have been. If I could run 2 Burglar Rats and not Cackling Fiend, I would. Liliana Spectre is right in between. It costs 3 mana, but it also gives you a 2-power flyer, which is great. There's a couple reasons Evasion is going to be really powerful in this deck, and we'll run into those later, but these cards give you the ETB discard, which we want, and then you can play a Marsh Crocodile, bounce Burglar Rats to hand, recast Burglar Rats. That interaction alone, even without these guys, that interaction has just made all of your opponents discard 3 cards. 1 off the Burglar Rats, 1 off the Crocodile, another 1 off the Burglar Rats. That's monstrous. This early in the game, this guy only costs 4. So being able to hit these guys that early to just destroy all the hands. If you have 3 opponents and each of them discards 3 cards, you're 9 cards up. It's unreal how fast that adds up. We got some spells in here. Unnerve and Siphon Mind are outstanding cards. These are, again, each opponent discards effects. You can't bounce them to your hand with a Crocodile, which makes me a little sad, but this one is each opponent discards 2 cards, which is wild. Siphon Mind draws you that many cards after each opponent discards 1, so both of these cards are excellent. Destroying hands. This card is kind of not good, but it's too beautiful for me to not play with. This is the Adventure Reaper of the Night. For 4 mana, target opponent discards 2 cards. Usually in this deck, I really want to share the love. I want to run cards that say all opponents or all players discard. This one gets the pass because after you make target opponent discard 2 cards, he is a 4/5 flyer for 7, which is nice. And he's so pretty. I'm into that. It's time to talk about my very favorite card in the entire deck. This, my friends, is Rotting Rats. We're going to move on from the each opponent discards. We're going to talk more about all players discard. So this is like a Burglar Rats that makes you discard as well, which I actually really like in this deck because of all the madness and the flashback we're running. I can take advantage of that discard outlet. So that's, in many cases, that will be an advantage to me and an active detriment to my opponent, so I'm into that. I'm super into, just like the Burglar Rat, casting Rotting Rats, bouncing it to hand with the Marsh Crocodile, casting it again. Everyone discards a ton of cards. The other thing I love about the Rotting Rats is that I mentioned a theme of this was sort of flashback. And this is a creature with flashback. That's effectively what Unearth is you get to flashback a creature for a turn. So if for some really weird reason you find yourself being forced to discard the Rotting Rats, that's okay. It will return itself to play and still cause everyone to discard. You can still get value out of this after this hits the graveyard, which is crazy good. Ear Splitting Rats is another card that's in here because I like madness effects. This is another each player discards when it comes into play. So this is sort of like the Cackling Fiend of the Rotting Rats department. It costs way too much. But it also gives you the ability to discard a card to regenerate it, which, again, for me this is only bonus. Discarding cards is great. I have the madness and the flashback to really capitalize on that. Regenerate is worth it, honestly. Like, Regenerate is a really powerful effect in a deck like this. If you're desperate, this can be the card that you bounce to hand with the Marsh Crocodile so you can cast it again. 4 is pretty pricey, but it'll get you there. The global discard is worth it. And if you're desperate about other things, you can start pitching cards to regenerate your rats. It's not great, but it'll get you there. The last two cards I want to talk about in the discard strategy are Mind Rake and Delirium Skeins. Delirium Skeins is 3 mana for each player discards 3 cards. Again, I'll take advantage of that. I've got Madness. Everyone else at the table is just going to suffer for it. This is a great way to just annihilate everyone's hands real fast. Imagine, let's set aside Mind Rake for a moment. Imagine that your curve is turn 2 Burglar Rats, turn 3 Delirium Skeins, turn 4 Marsh Crocodile, Bouncing Rats, turn 5 Rats. Each opponent has just discarded 6 cards on turn 5. This is ridiculous. No one's coming back from that. The game is over at that point. You just get to beat people to death with your Marsh Crocodile and feel great about it. Mind Rake is sort of like a poor man's Delirium Skeins, but it gives you some options. Delirium Skeins is always 3 mana for everyone discards 3. Mind Rake, usually you're going to be hitting the Overload. So for 2 mana, all players discard 2. Sometimes, in rare circumstances, you only want to hit 1 player instead of the whole board including yourself, and then you can pay 3 to target a player with it instead of participating. So the versatility here is very good. It's not quite as... 3 cards is just outstanding on Delirium Skeins. So the 2 cards is good enough, and the versatility of being able to hit the board or hit a player is really, really good on Mind Rake. That's the discard suite. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 cards in the deck dedicated to hand disruption, not including the Crocodile. So I guess technically there is one more little piece of hand disruption, but it goes here with the Madness pile. This is Psychotic Episode. It only hits 1 player, so that's a little bit sad, but it's good enough that we take it. Target player reveals his or her hand and the top card of their library, and then I choose one of those cards and put it on the bottom of their library. Before you were allowed to tuck commanders whenever they would change zones, this card single-handedly won me a lot of games by bouncing a commander to its owner's hand and then casting Psychotic Episode to tuck that commander under the opponent's deck. You used to be able to just completely lock people out of games with Psychotic Episode. It's less good now. If you do it to a commander, your opponent can just choose to send it to the command zone instead. So not a ton of value to have there. But you do get to just pick the best card that they have available and make it really, really hard to access. In Pauper EDH, tucking something to the bottom of someone's deck makes it much, much more inaccessible than putting it in the graveyard. So this is great, and it also has Madness. So when we start using all these effects that make us discard cards, we can, instead of discarding, just cast this for free and just ignore all the drawbacks for the self-discard and get free spells. It's fantastic. The Madness suite continues with one of my favorites, Grave Scrabbler. This is a 2 mana 2/2 that puts a creature card from your graveyard back in your hand. So you saw how thorough the discard suite was. I talked a lot about Madness, but we're not always going to have the Madness spell to discard. Sometimes you're going to end up discarding a creature that you really like. Grave Scrabbler will just let you get it back, basically for free. Next time you end up discarding something, just cast him instead. God, it's so good. Get a card back. The amount of value you generate with the Grave Scrabbler is nuts. Brain Gorgers is not a good card, but it's sort of one of my pet cards. I really, really like the Madness on this one. This is a 2 mana 4/2 that your opponents can counterspell simply by sacrificing a creature. It's because they're slow eaters. So I'm very into this. The Madness is excellent. Speaking of Madness being excellent, here's a 2 mana 2/4 Death Touch. Alright, that should cost 5, but it costs 2, so that's a thing. Here's Just the Wind. Here we got some Madness removal. This is one that's actually pretty good to just cast as a removal spell if you can't hit that Madness trigger. Just costs 2 mana to bounce a creature, or if you do have the Madness trigger, it costs 1. One of the big sort of problems this deck has, as compared to something like Azra Oddsmaker, is when the Oddsmaker is discarding cards, it's probably doing so with all its mana up and available and ready to go. That's why the Oddsmaker runs things like Acre Slick. The Madness cost on Acre Slick is 4 mana, and you can, with the Oddsmaker, you can just pay that easily because you're discarding cards before you've cast anything this turn. Marsh Croc does not run Acre Slick because it's 2 mana intensive. When the Marsh Croc deck is discarding spells, it's doing so because it has just cast the Marsh Crocodile, or because it just cast Ear-Splitting Rats, or because it just cast Delirium Skeins. So when you're discarding in this deck, it's because you've already cast a spell for your turn. So trying to hit 4 mana for the Crocodile and then another 4 for the Acre Slick is just, it's 2 mana intensive for a deck that wants to be playing a lot more spells than that. But Just the Wind is perfect. The Madness cost is 1. You'll notice that so far all of our Madness costs have been cheap. We got the 2 mana, 2 mana, 2 mana, 2 mana. Just the Wind is even cheaper at 1. So we're trying to keep all our Madness costs really low so that we can definitely know that we have the mana to play these things after we cast the Crocodile and make that 4 mana investment. Murderous Compulsion, another cheap removal spell. Costs 2 to cast, or it costs 2 to Madness. You can destroy tapped creatures. Dark Withering. We only ever cast this with Madness. This is 1 mana to destroy a non-black creature, as is fantastic. Psychotic Haze is a great little board wipe. It'll deal 1 damage to each creature and each player for 2 mana. It's a great way to clear out tokens. This deck has a lot of little 1-butts. You've kind of seen some of them. The Burglar Rats, the Ear-Splitting Rats, the Cackling Fiend, Lily Spectre. We got a lot of 1-butts going on our side of the field. So Psychotic Haze is not always the best card for us. But the nice thing about it is you can cast the Marsh Crocodile, use his Enter the Battlefield bounce effect to save your 1-butt, and then use his discard effect to Madness in Psychotic Haze. This is what I mean about all the different pieces coming together and just being super interwoven and interconnected and synergistic. This deck is rife with these cool niche interactions that are just going to generate value all day long. So we like those. Nagging Thoughts and Obsessive Search are my 2 favorite Madness draw spells. Obsessive Search will just draw your card. It's fantastic. You get to do that instead of discarding. It's just raw value. Nagging Thoughts costs 1 more mana, but will let you draw the top card, or 1 card from the top 2, and it'll put the other one into your graveyard, where you can flash it back, or put it back in your hand with a Grave Scrabbler if you want, or maybe it's just a land that you don't need. So both of these cards are excellent. They will, instead of discarding cards, they will keep your hand full while everyone else keeps their hand empty. That's how you win games with the Marsh Crocodile, and that's why it's grindy and kind of miserable. Call to the Netherworld is the other Madness card that'll put cards back into our hand. This one, Madness is in for free. It's a free spell. It doesn't cost you your discard, and it doesn't cost you any mana. This is just free real estate. And it'll return something you've already discarded or something that died back in your hand. If your Burglar Rats gets killed, just get it back and keep that discard chain going. This is an excellent card. So we also have some flashback stuff. Deep Analysis and Think Twice will both draw some cards, again, for pretty cheap. I used to have Scour All Possibilities in here, but I just ended up taking that out. The flashback cost was much too high. 5 to flash it back was too much. These guys flashback for cheap. This one only costs 3 to flashback. This one costs 2 and 3 life to flashback, and they'll just draw your cards for days. These cards are fantastic. These are cards that you can just hardcast and feel great about hardcasting them, or you can discard them to Marsh, Crocodile, or Delirium Skeins and feel great about discarding them because then you can flash them back. Either way, both of those decisions are the correct decision for those cards. You can't go wrong with this deck. This is some more Flashback. These will put hopefully very specific cards in your hand. Forbidden Alchemy is like an impulse. You get to look at the top 4 cards, pick the one you like best, put it in your hand. Again, this card, like Nagging Thoughts, is going to put the others into your graveyard, which is where we want them. There's enough Flashback and Unearth and other stuff in this deck that putting stuff in your grave is great. And it flashes back to you. You can use this twice, or just pitch it to a croc and use it once. This guy also has a flashback cost. This will search your library for any instant and just put it into your hand. For example, yeah, we're going to get there. Stay tuned. So, just finding Ghostly Flicker, putting that into your hand, and then finding a different one you like better, maybe a Counterspell or an Arcane Denial. This is... Mystical Teachings is fantastic. And again, you can cast them, get the value. You can pitch them and still get the value. There's no wrong moves with these flashback cards. One more flashback card. This is a removal thing. It's kind of like the Just the Wind, but this one's the flashback flavor instead of the madness flavor. 5 mana is pretty pricey, but we need that flashback. And we need the bounce too. One of the best ways for this deck to get rid of a creature is to bounce it to the owner's hand and then force them to discard it. So those bouncy effects get really good. So we take those. I have one more card that's sort of technically in the flashback seat. This is flashback adjacent. Sanitarium Skeleton, you can just pay 3 mana to put it back in your hand. So in a pinch, you can just use this as a blocker over and over and over again. The better plan for this is to discard it to the Marsh Crocodile, put it back in your hand, and then have it in your hand to discard for the next time you play the Marsh Crocodile. These kind of value engines where you can discard stuff without really losing anything, but your opponents are all discarding all their cards all the time. That's what makes this deck run. So Sanitarium Skeleton's a great card. I know they just printed a new one in Ikoria, the Durable Coil Bug. It has a similar effect, but it's a 2 mana 2/2 that costs 5 to put back in your hand. I'm still on the fence about whether or not I want to include that. 5 mana is just a lot of mana, and the deck has enough other madness and flashback outlets that I'm not sure I need 2 skeletons. But we'll see. It is definitely on the radar, so stay tuned for possible changes there. So that's what we're going to do with the discard engines and the madness and the flashback suite. The next thing I think we need to talk about is we're going to abuse the Marsh Crocodile's other ability to bounce creatures to our hand. So we need more creatures that have enter the battlefield effects. And we've already seen a bunch of these in the discard suite. We've seen the Burglar Rats, the Rotting Rats, the Ear-Splitting Rats, Lily Spectre. So we've already seen a bunch of these where we can just generate value by bouncing them to our hand and then hitting the Marsh Crocodile. But there's more. On the cheap side, we have Augury Owl. Scrying 3 is fantastic. This card only costs 2 mana. So if you don't have the Burglar Rats in your opening hand, you can hit this Owl, get your Scry 3, bounce it to hand with the Marsh Crocodile, and then Scry 3 again later. Adding those Scries up will smooth out your draws fantastically. Thalicos Seer is very interesting, largely because it draws you a card when it leaves play, which is fine. We're going to make it leave play a lot. We're going to bounce it to our hand and then draw a card off it, and then we'll play it again. Shadow is also really useful in this deck, as is Flying, for some reasons that will become clear in a little bit. So Thalicos Seer and Augury Owl, great ways to generate value. Mole Drifter is the third and final member of the draw off of its repeated castings suite. So as a 5 mana 2/2 flyer that draws you 2 when it comes in. It gets kind of expensive to bounce it with Marsh, Crocodile and play it again, but those 2 cards are worth it. Moldrifter's great. I'm only running 2 of these. I know that there's more. Salvager of Secrets and Scrivener, and the other one, there's a new one coming out in M21, I think. 2, I think, is the correct number for this deck. We're not going for the Drake combo. It's not super critical that we hit that. We just like to have the ability to get a card back every now and again when we want to. If we want to Delirium Skeins a second time. And these are, of all the ones that exist, these are my favorites. Archaeomancer is the cheapest at 4 mana. Mnemonic Wall's just got a big butt. It's hard to kill. It'll stick around for a while. So those are the cards that'll get spells back from the graveyard. These are the cards that'll get creatures back from the graveyard. Cadaver Imp, again, is the cheapest of these options at 3 mana. Gravedigger is a great card, costs 4. It's a little too pricey for this deck. I want Cadaver Imp to have that seat. Speaking of 4 mana being too pricey, Dakara Scavenger is not a great card, but it is a Crocodile, and I feel like that's important. So the other reason that I run the Scavenger is because this deck needs a couple bodies. Marsh Croc cannot be the biggest creature in the deck. He's big. He's not small. 4/4 is a beating for sure, but having a couple other creatures that will be massive, discourage attacks, and deliver some beats themselves is important. So the Scavenger, he can put artifacts or creatures on top of my library. He doesn't put them into hand. If he put them directly into hand, he would be fantastic. But as it is, he's a very slow Cadaver Imp. But he does have a 4/6 body. And he's a Crocodile. So, we'll take it. This is sort of the control package. We have Mana War and Mist Raven. These are my 2 favorite ETB bounce creatures. The Mist Raven flies on a 2/2 body. Mana War just costs 3. It's cheap, it's nice, it's great. It's a jellyfish. I love jellyfish. Who doesn't love jellyfish? Both of them will bounce creatures when they enter the battlefield, which is pretty important. Again, partly to clear the board, partly because putting cards in your opponent's hand so that you can Delirium Skeins the cards out of their hand just feels great. Speaking of bouncing cards to people's hands so that you can make them discard those cards, it's time to talk about Dinrova Horror. This is the other card that gets the I have a huge body seat. 6 mana is a little rough for something that we're going to bounce to our own hand and try to recast. So this is a big part of what this Ghostly Flicker is for. If we can, even if we only get the Dinrova Horror's ETB once, it's still kind of a blowout. You're going to bounce a permanent, and then you're going to make someone discard their hand. So if they don't have any cards in their hand, which is extremely likely against this deck, you just get to destroy any permanent, essentially. You bounce it to their hand, and then you force them to discard that card. It'll just put a permanent into their graveyard without even triggering dies effects. It's pretty outstanding. And if we can get extra value out of it by flickering it, it's going to go nuts. So that's the suite of creatures that are going to generate crazy value by bouncing, by entering the battlefield over and over again. Some of them are expensive, but they're pretty great. Also in this pile is all the discard effects, the Burglar Rats, the Rotting Rats. So the pile is actually bigger than this. This is just the ones that don't discard. With that in mind, thinking about the size of that pile of cards that have great enter the battlefield effects, it's time to talk about these 2 cards. Displace and Ghostly Flicker are 3 mana instants that can exile 2 creatures and then put them right back into play. This is how we really, really abuse those enter the battlefield effects. Flickering Dinrova Horror for an extra bounce and discard is unreal. Flickering a Moldrifter is fantastic. You can flicker a Moldrifter after you have evoked it in response to its sacrifice trigger to get 4 cards and then keep the Moldrifter. It's bonkers good. You can, obviously, the sort of the most well-known combo in our format is Ghostly Flicker or Displacing an Archaeomancer. and then immediately getting back the Ghostly Flicker. This deck doesn't run Drake, because Drake is stupid. But it does run the Archomancer, the Mnemonic Wall, you've seen those, and these two cards. So it can't go infinite on those guys without the Drake, but it can go crazy repeatable on those with just a ton of mana. So they're great. They are crazy value engines. And I mean, they also just dodge removal. If someone is trying to kill your Crocodile, you can just flicker it and then get extra self-bounce, extra discard. It's crazy. This is another card we have in the abuse these ETBs category, sort of the help them to recur. Our deck is really designed around bouncing creatures to our hand, so that we get to do this is incredible, and that each other player has to do it is great. This is an excellent answer to things that have hexproof or shroud. You can force them back into their hand with this without targeting them after you've targeted, killed, or bounced all their other creatures. And then once it's back in their hand, you can force the discard. So it's very, very hard to answer shroud or hexproof creatures in Pauper, but this deck can do it. Cavern Harpy is another one of these cards that sits in this self-bounce category. This is a 2-mana, 2/1 flyer that has the first half of the Marsh Crocodile's same ability. When it comes into play, you get to bounce another one of your creatures to your hand. So this is a great way to just recur value on a Burglar Rats or recur value on other things. So the biggest problem with the Marsh Crocodile is that after you do that, your Marsh Crocodile is stuck in play, and unless you can find a way to flicker it or curfew it or somehow, you have to find an external method for getting the Marsh Crocodile to enter the battlefield again. Maybe someone kills it and it goes to the command zone and then you do it again for 6. Not super efficient. So the thing that makes this Cavern Harpy super extra beautiful is that its second ability is that you can pay 1 life to just bounce it to your hand. So you can cast it, bounce the Burglar Rats, play the Burglar Rats, and then you can just put this back in your hand and do that again. This is such a crazy value generating engine in this deck, full of cheap, powerful enter the battlefield effects. You could even cast the Cavern Harpy to bounce the Marsh Crocodile to your hand, and then you can pay 1 life to put the Cavern Harpy back in your hand. It's crazy good. Just lets you get these enter the battlefield effects over and over and over again. This is one of the best cards in the deck. My other sort of favorite thing about this is that it's basically immune to removal. Anytime anyone ever tries to kill this Cavern Harpy, you can just pay 1 life to return it to your hand. If someone tries to kill it in response to that, you just pay another life and return it to your hand again. You can just put that on the stack as many times as you need to get this Cavern Harpy to safety. I assume someday eventually you might run out of life, but it seems unlikely. This card is fantastic. So, the other technique that we're going to use to bounce Marsh Crocodile and our other spells back to our hands is ninjas. Ninjas, I mentioned earlier that the Augury Owl having evasion was good, Lily Spectre having evasion was good, Thalicos Seer with its shadow was good. The reason for that is that ninjas are crazy. Not only do they provide incredible saboteur effects when they connect with someone, and connecting should be pretty easy with all these small evasive creatures we have, they also let you bounce those creatures to your hand so you can generate more value. One of my favorite things to do in this deck is attack with the Marsh Crocodile, which is going to get through because it's a 4/4. He's a beefy boy. He's hard to block. So you attack with the Marsh Crocodile. When he gets through, you swap him for the Mistblade Shinobi, tapped and attacking with that ninjutsu ability. You get to bounce one of their creatures to their hand, and then you recast the Crocodile, bouncing the Mistblade Shinobi back in your hand so that you can just do that again. This just cycles over and over and over again. Mistblade Shinobi, ninjutsus for 1, bounces a creature. Moonblade Shinobi, ninjutsus for 3, and creates little illusion tokens. Ninja della Notte Fonda, something my friend traded me. I think this is Italian. He thought that a creature named Fonda was the funniest thing in the world. I guess he really, really liked the movie Barbarella. I don't know. But yeah, this is Ninja of the Deep Hours. It ninjutsu's in for 2, and when it connects to a player, you draw a card. This is probably the best ninja there is. We got one more ninja. It's this guy. If you do not like adult language, if you want this video to stay PG-13, mute the next 30 seconds because I'm going to talk about this card. When this card came out, it ruined so many people's hands that I had to give it a nickname. And the nickname I gave this card is the Skullfuckers. I cannot think of any other explanation for why a creature would damage you and make you discard 2 cards at once. This is bonkers good. Yeah, I won so many Betrayers of Kamigawa drafts on the back of this card, just ninjaing it, attacking on turn 4 to get through and discard 2 cards, and then on turn 5 you can just play a removal spell to clear the blocker and make them discard 2 more cards, and the game is just over immediately. So combining this sort of discard engine with the Marsh Crocodile's discard engine and all the other discard we have in here, we're going to ruin some people's hands with this ninja. It's going to be great. So, the 4 ninjas, the Cavern Harpy, the Ghostly Flicker, the Displace, that is my suite of spells that we're going to use to keep getting value out of our Enter the Battlefield creatures. The next section of cards we have are just really solid, good cards. We'll start with the Capsize. This is just incredible removal. We've already talked about how bouncing cards is really powerful in this deck because then you can force the discard. Bouncing cards repeatedly. This just solves problems all day long. This card is a menace. Arcane Denial and Counterspell are the 2 of the counters I run. This deck only runs 3 counterspells. These, I think, are the best ones. They're both hard counters. The Denial is sort of like an apology counterspell where it'll give someone some cards in exchange, but it gives you a card too, so it's not much of an apology. This is just a standard issue counterspell, 2 blue counterspell. Those are great ways to control bad things from happening. Soul Manipulation is the last counterspell. It only targets creatures, which I'm not a huge fan of. But it also does a Raise Dead thing, where it can pull a creature card from your graveyard back in your hand. So this is a great way to just 2-for-1 someone, or if the creature you pull back is a Burglar Rats, I guess you're 3-for-1ing them. It's pretty great. I guess technically there's a 4th counterspell, but it's Perplex, and it's honestly not much of a counterspell. It's a soft counter, and the out for it is the opponent can choose to discard their entire hand to have their spell not get countered. Under normal circumstances, this is it's kind of a tough choice to make, whether you're going to let your spell resolve by discarding your entire hand or let your spell get countered and keep your hand. Lots of the times against this deck, it's not really a hard choice at all. Like, a lot of the times if someone's casting a spell, it's probably the last spell in their hand anyway, and casting Perplex isn't going to do anything. So mostly this card, sometimes it'll work, and then it's just funny to make someone discard their entire hand in this discard deck. Most of the times this is just in here to transmute. This transmutes at 3, so this will get your Ghostly Flickers, this will get your Displaces. This could get your Liliana Spectre or your Delirium Skeins if you really need that extra discard. So this is it's a great tutor. Speaking of things that transmute, we have the Brain Spoil. This guy it can destroy a creature if you want it to. I guess that's pretty good, but most of the time this transmutes for 5. You might be wondering what in here costs 5, and I will tell you, it's Gary. It's probably not surprising. Attacking with a 4/4 Marsh Crocodile is good, but Gary is just better at closing out games. They should be doming people for 5, 6, 7 damage. It gets out of hand in a hurry. And then, can we talk about bouncing Gary to our hand and just doing it again? Or Ghostly Flickering Gary? Or ninjutsuing Gary? It's going to get gross. We're going to Gary over and over and over again. The other transmute card we have here is Shred Memory. Shred Memory is great. It transmutes for 2. The thing in this deck for 2 mana that we really, really are looking for to get into our hand is Cavern Harpy. That's how good Cavern Harpy is. I wasn't joking about it being one of the most powerful cards in this deck. It will just solve problems for you all day long. So this card is a dedicated Cavern Harpy fetcher. The other great thing about this card is that as a discard deck, we're kind of vulnerable to graveyard decks. There are some decks that we will play against where they want everything to be in their graveyard. That's great for them. So that's going to be kind of a problem for us. If we're helping them put their cards in their graveyard, we're going to struggle a little bit. So you can just cast Shred Memory to exile 4 cards from someone's graveyard. That's not a bad plan. This can hit someone's, and it's an instant. So it can hit, if someone is trying to target their own Ghostly Flicker or their own Displace with an Archaeomancer or something, you can just exile that in response. It's great. We also have Fairy Macabre to fill that role. Fairy Macabre is extra good at disrupting graveyard strategies because it's not even really a spell. If you're discarding the Fairy Macabre to exile 2 cards from someone's graveyard, first of all, you're not paying any mana for it, so it's kind of like Force of Will. Second of all, it can't be countered because it's not a spell, it's just an ability. You're using her ability by discarding her. So if you're against the graveyard strategy, both of these cards are incredible. And this one is tutorable. You can go get this one with Perplex if you want to. This one is the tutor, so you have to decide whether you want to Shred Memory or get your Cavern Harpy. But these are both very good. If you're really desperate, you can just cast the Fairy Macabre and start beating people in the air for 2. It's really easy to get back in your hand if you think you'll need it in your hand later. You can ninjutsu it back to your hand. You can Marsh Crocodile it back to your hand. You can discard it to exile 2 cards from a graveyard, and then you can put it back in your hand with a Grave Scrabbler, and then do that again. We have a lot of options with the Fairy Macabre. We need to talk about some staples. Here's Pestilence and Crypt Rats. They're great. You know them. You know about Pestilence and Crypt Rats. They just kill everything all the time. This is a good fallback plan. If someone is playing a really aggressive deck and they sort of get away from you before you can make them discard everything, you can just kill everything. And then their hand is still empty and they have no board presence. The last card we have here is sort of the miscellaneous slot, and that's Notion Rain. Surveil 2 and then draw 2. So we can put cards into our graveyard if we want, which is a good place for cards to be when they have Flashback. And then we get to draw 2 for 4 mana. It's a strictly better Read the Bones. And that says a lot, because Read the Bones is fantastic. That's about it for the spells. We have some ramp here. Wayfarer's Bauble is the standard issue ramp that I put into pretty much everything. On turn 1 and 2, it'll just ramp you up to 4 mana pretty much immediately. It's great. Thins your deck. I have a Dimir Signet. It's good fixing. It's cheap. It's a great card. Very simple, straightforward. And then I have the things that sacrifice 4 mana. I chose not to run Orazka Relic or Commander Sphere in this one. I probably should be running Commander Sphere instead of Dimir Cluestone. It's just strictly better than Dimir Cluestone, isn't it? Maybe the reason I'm not running Commander Sphere is because I don't have a foil. This deck is mostly foil. That might be it. Anyway, this is the suite of mana rocks that will tap to give you some mana, and then later they can sacrifice to draw your cards if you end up in a pickle and you really need cards more than mana. That's the entire ramp suite. It's just those 5. That's all we got. The deck has enough draw power that it should be hitting. You should be seeing land drop number 3, 4, 5 pretty easily. You might miss number 6, but that's okay. So will everyone else at the table if you've done your job right with discarding things. For a mana base, we're running a lot of lands because we want to make sure that we are hitting those land drops pretty consistently through some discard effects. Command Tower and Opal Palace are great. This will make your 4/4 Marsh Croc into a 5/5 or 6/6 or 7/7 Marsh Croc, so that's pretty important. Command Tower, I don't know why this particular Command Tower is so dark, but it's great. I love the look of it. We got enters the play tapped and does a cool thing abilities. This will shut down a creature for a turn. This will exile someone's entire graveyard. So this is the third piece of our graveyard hate, alongside Shred Memory and Fairy Macabre. We have hopefully enters the battlefield untapped stuff. Mystic Sanctuary with Ghostly Flicker. Ghostly Flicker can hit lands, so that's gross. Both of these cards will do some minor effect. They'll put cards from our graveyard back on top of our library if we have enough other basic lands of that type to get that trigger. So hopefully we'll be able to utilize those. These are the dual lands. They come into play tapped. Tap for either color. It's great fixing. I love the art on Submerged Boneyard. It's just... I love the whales. It's a beautiful card. Dimir Aqueduct is the last of our non-basics. This is good for bouncing the Mystic Sanctuary or the Witches, or even the Bajuka Bog. You can get some extra value out of some of those ETB lands with the Aqueduct, or it's just a great way to have extra mana from fewer cards. So if you're looking at a 2-land hand, it's probably pretty bad, unless one of them is Aqueduct. You already got 3 mana out of those 2 lands. If you got that and a Dimir Cluestone, then you're all set. That's your 4 mana. You're good to go. The rest is basics. Basic islands, basic swamps. I think we're running 37 lands in this deck, which is a lot. It's a big number, but the deck needs to be hitting those land drops. Sometimes you're going to have to discard some lands, so drawing into more lands to make sure that you have all of the mana you need to cast the Croc over and over again, and also be madnessing things and bouncing your own things and recasting them. It's a pretty mana intensive deck, so 37 feels like the correct number to me. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's the interconnected mess that is the Marsh Crocodile deck. It's so much fun to talk about and so miserable to play all the time.